Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session, the U.S. National Cyber Label Program for Consumer Connected Devices. My name is David Grossman. I'm the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for the Consumer Technology Association. I'm joined on stage by Dr. Amit Alizari of Intel, Eric Tamarkin of Samsung, Kat Megas of NIST, and my colleague at the Consumer Technology Association, Mike Bergman. Just real quick, CTA, the Consumer Technology Association, we are North America's largest tech trade association. We have some 1,500 member companies, small to larger companies like two of them here on the stage. We are perhaps most well recognized for being the owner and producer of the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, in Vegas every January. So to set the stage for this discussion, I just want to have a show of hands. How many of you are familiar with this program? Wow, okay. Actually more than I expected. Well, to set the stage, I'd like to turn to my colleague, Mike Bergman, to give some background on the program, and we'll then continue into a moderated discussion. And then at the very end, if we have time, we'd love to take some audience Q&A.
Great, thank you, David. We have the pro forma disclaimer here that you've seen on other sessions. There we go. So I'm going to do a brief overview of this program. The motivation has been not just the need for better security for connected devices of all types, but also in the context of a growing background of regulatory requirements, best practices, expectations by governments around the world. To date, I'm not going to read this off, but to date there's been a number of activities that have led to this situation. Not on the screen is the Mirai botnet attack, which I think was a stimulating event for the Trump executive order of May 2017, that first item. That led to some baseline security requirement work by NIST, the 8259 series and 800-213. If you're not familiar with these documents and you're interested in connected device security, I strongly recommend checking those out. So those minimum requirements then became part of, through the Cybersecurity Act, became required for federal agencies. The IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act strengthened that, and OMB released a notice in December reminding federal agencies that compliance with these baselines, with NIST standards and guidelines was expected. The Biden administration tasked NIST with developing criteria for a consumer connected label. They have done that. That was released as 8425. I'll be referring to 8425. It's a component of this program. And the National Cybersecurity Strategy does also refer to this program. Basically, this program was launched by the White House in October. National Security Council Representative Steve Kelly is to blame. He's in the front row here. Under the direction, of course, of Ann Neuberger. And at that stakeholder meeting in Washington, manufacturers, the two companies represented here, NIST also represented here, consumer advocates, our association, our group, a number of others, CSA, the Matter people. So there are quite a few key stakeholders involved in the launch and continuing on. So the question is, what is a consumer IoT device? It's not exactly what you might think, not coming into this, if you haven't been in this program already. It is a connected device, connected computing device that can somehow interact with the environment, either a sensor or an actuator, unless it's a smartphone, which it's not IoT, or a laptop, which has plenty of sensors and speakers. Those are sensors and actuators. That's not IoT either, because that's general IT equipment. It's not a server in a data center with a thermal shutdown sensor, even though that's a sensor. IoT is kind of what you think IoT is. It's not IT. But it does include consumer routers because of a general consideration that we need to address them, and the tools that we're using to address consumer connected devices are amenable to routers. Whoops. There we go. I think I just stabbed somebody in the eye with a laser. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, so what's the plan? Reduced to the simplest elements. Create a single common mark, a single common certification mark. Set criteria for use of that mark. License existing programs, like UL has a cybersecurity program, Eurofins, Intertek, DECRA, CSA Matter, they're putting together one. IOXT has one. So there's a bunch of programs already. There's also like walled garden programs through consumer goods makers and service providers, Apple, Comcast, Samsung. Samsung works with SmartThings. So there's these programs that already verify the cybersecurity of connected devices. We can leverage that, and that is the plan. Then finally, promote and advertise domestically, get consumers aware of it, retailers, everybody recognizing that this is a mark of security. And then also negotiate internationally for mutual recognition so that the mark can be used in other markets. The last point on the slide was that it's a voluntary program. It is not a mandatory requirement. So I said my list was create a single common US label. Currently, it kind of looks like this. The trademark at the center of the screen, the eagle, the screaming eagle clutching a padlock, is a mock-up. Do not take that home and say, this is what I'm going to look for. It's just a mock-up. I did it in PowerPoint. Sorry, folks. The QR code is part of the mark. It points to a product-specific page that gives it more consumer-friendly information. And then from there will be a researcher-friendly link that will give stuff that is not consumer-friendly, but maybe something a little bit more for someone who's going to look into more detail. Set criteria for the use of the mark. Number 2 on my list, NIST 8425. I mentioned this earlier. The NIST criteria sets technical and non-technical requirements. The technical requirements are things like encryption, like no default passwords, device identification capability, things like that. There's 17 of them. The non-technical requirements in this document are things like documentation that you should maintain or be able to publish. Things like what do you do about vulnerability handling? What's your support strategy, or policy rather? So that document is very well accepted by everybody who's sort of like setting this program up. So we're past that mark. That's published. That's done. Now, license existing voluntary label programs to issue the mark. So if you think about a label scheme, a scheme being the requirements and the other aspects of the program that you might find out if you went to UL or Eurofins or DECRA or Intertek for a cybersecurity label for your product, what you'll find is they'll have a scheme. It's all set up. What we're going to do is anchor that at 2 ends. One anchor is the NIST criteria over here at the one far end. The other is the national mark. It's that common mark, the screaming eagle with the padlock that we're not going to use. We don't have to have just one scheme. This is not a single US structure. The IoT is too broad and too vast and too varied to use a single scheme. Drones are different from doorbell cameras. Drones fly over the horizon. Doorbell cameras typically do not, except in The Wizard of Oz. So you've got multiple schemes licensed to issue the mark. And at the end of the day, we need some kind of oversight structure. The government wants some understanding that the trust mechanisms that we build into the program are working. Industry wants some appreciation that the trust mechanisms are working because their competitors may be using the mark, and they want to know that if they're going through the work to get the mark, they want their competitors to have to go through the same work. So this gives us labels at scale. This is my third item, license the existing voluntary industry label programs. And that takes us into the sort of the meat of the program. So that was just a really quick run through of what this program is about, what it's structured as. So if you think of it as we take an existing label program, we have criteria for use of the mark, we license the program, the scheme owner to issue the mark, then they can use their normal business processes with manufacturers, sign contracts, sublicense the mark to them to put on packages. At the oversight structure, there will be a program owner, a federal agency yet to be named. We understand that may be a big announcement coming in some number of weeks, possibly in May, but we'll leave that to our friends at the White House to talk about.
All right.
David?
Well, I appreciate you setting the stage for us, Mike. I'd like to bring in the rest of our panelists into the discussion and ask each of you, how do your organizations fit into this program? We'll start with Amit.
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, this is RSA, so I trust you all already, and I'm going to give you a scoop. I'm talking today, so I'm still head of cybersecurity policy of Intel, but as of next week, I'm going to be the co-founder and CEO of a new company called Open Policy, aiming to democratize policy and standards. But I'm also here as the co-editor of ISO IEC 27402, almost in final stages in what we call in this. My co-editors are Faoud Khan from Canada and Elaine Newton from Oracle. And this is work that has started already from 2018 and 19, of course, with global participation, including our friends here, CTA at CS1, and of course, Cat Mags and NIST and Samsung and everyone, thinking about security baseline measures. So the way all of this is connected to Intel, because you're probably wondering, right? Intel, you do PCs, right? And you supply architectures, foundational security solutions to almost every IoT devices, but traditionally we're not in the consumer IoT space. The way we are connected to this is from the landscape of our understanding that there is a need, urgent need, to create a culture of up-leveling and raising the baseline culture when it comes to secure by design and security and transparency of the processes that promote security, like processes to support code and vulnerability disclosure. So this is why we're engaged in these conversations, and this is why I'm also the co-editor of international standards to support that. Now, in a more direct kind of element, we are recognizing that today's conversation about consumer IoT is not going to stay there. Right now, we are at a moment when it comes to product security. I shared a little bit of that in the CHIPS Act panel just yesterday, and we also talked about this initiative from the National Security Council with my colleague and friend and, of course, our government partners, Steve Kelly from the White House, where we talked about that moment of product security. So I inspire you to think about this in the context of a broader conversation on both baseline security measures, as well as the importance of securing all connected devices like PC and server, et cetera, which is where Intel operates. And you're going to hear a lot more about this from my fellow colleagues here on the panel.
Eric, how does Samsung fit in?
Thanks, David. For those of you who don't know Samsung, we're the world's leading manufacturer of consumer electronics, networks, mobile, and semiconductors. About 72% of US households have at least one Samsung device. But the reason we're here today, as a leading manufacturer of connected devices, Samsung's here to support a voluntary IoT cyber labeling program here in the United States that's globally harmonized and has incentives for manufacturers for adoption. We've been working with our government and industry partners on this, and we hope for a successful launch soon.
All right, that's some breaking news right there.
Hey.
Let's turn to Kat from NIST. How does NIST fit in?
Thank you. So I think Mike did a great job of giving some of the background. For those of you that don't know NIST, we are part of Department of Commerce. Our work is voluntary, typically, when it comes to our work around cybersecurity. Our work is focused on our goal, which is supporting trust in information technology. So a little bit of background just on the IoT cybersecurity program. As IoT started getting integrated into federal agencies, we started looking at these connected technologies and tried to understand how is this new technology introducing risk into the enterprise. And soon we started understanding, as we started trying to gather input from stakeholders, that there was an important role that the products and the devices played in enterprises being able to secure their enterprise. And this is where our focus kind of started looking at product cybersecurity and connected product cybersecurity, and where we started working with our colleagues here As Mike alluded to, we started out with what we called the core baseline, which was a core set of recommendations intended to apply across the board for all IoT devices, irrespective of market sector. The reason we started is because the idea of fragmentation is a theme that came up very early in our work. We heard it loud and clear. So we felt that looking across all market sectors, we should start with a common core baseline. And then more recently, we've been focusing on tailoring that baseline. We started with that same core baseline. As Mike mentioned, we tailored it for the U.S. federal government in 800-213, looking at the risk profile of the U.S. federal government, what were the U.S. federal government needs when looking at acquiring IoT devices and products. And more recently, in the executive order, we were directed to pilot a label for IoT cybersecurity for products. And what we did is we went back to that same core baseline. We worked openly with our colleagues here. We invited public comment, held a number of workshops, and we tailored that core baseline, understanding that this was going to be focused on consumers. A couple of important things to highlight, though, is that we made a couple of decisions as we looked at tailoring the work, as Mike answered. IoT is so big and so broad, coming up with a set of criteria that was going to be applicable to both drones and doorbells was going to be a vast area to cover. So we decided the optimal way to approach this would be to articulate requirements as cybersecurity outcomes. And rather than get very specific into how we expect those cybersecurity outcomes to be achieved, we tried to articulate these are the outcomes we believe every IoT, consumer IoT device should be able to support. And that's where the role of standards come in and the important work that we worked closely with Amit and others on in the international standard space is starting to articulate the how these cybersecurity outcomes can be met in these products. We made a couple of other tweaks, just understanding we were looking at consumers. The level of expectations and understanding around cybersecurity of a consumer would potentially be different than an enterprise. And this was all encapsulated in NIST IR 8425. Now, and I'd like to reinforce those are recommendations. As Mike mentioned, there is going to be a program owner that is going to be responsible. Ultimately, NIST's role is to provide those recommendations. It will be ultimately up to the program owner to determine how they will apply those recommendations, how they will enforce them and accept them. And our role will be to be there to advise the program owner on the 8425 recommendations, and also to help advise on other things such as conformity assessment programs, which is another sort of core expertise that NIST can offer to the program owner in the future.
And Mike, you obviously introduced and opened the topic, so it's assumed that CTA has a role both as an industry association and a standard-setting organization. But can you just briefly explain how CTA looks at this?
Yes, we've taken a little bit different approach than a lot of our programs. As a trade association, we have member programs. We do a lot of things that benefit our members. But in this case, this needs to be a truly national effort. And so what we've done is basically set it up as a big tent effort. We have welcomed anyone with a material interest in helping develop the framework of this label program. As Kat mentioned, as we've mentioned, there's going to be a program owner on the government side, but there isn't already a cybersecurity label entity within the government. So we need to build this up. So we've been building it. We anticipate having a close relationship with the program owner once this is up and running. And the pieces that we're building now will be negotiated a little bit, but I expect quite a bit of what we're doing is going to be essentially adopted into this program in one form or another. So the net is that the program owner will go through certain processes working with the private sector. And we're representing essentially a convening of the private sector in doing this. And that program owner will be licensing the entities through either direct relationships or through private sector license authorities or other types of structures. So we have a bunch of business processes and technical standards to put together to wrap this all up. I did want to mention one thing on technical standards. A common question we get is, what's the technical standard? Will it be one of the IoT standards that's out there right now, EN 303645, IEC 62443? The answer is yes. If a scheme can qualify as compliant with NIST's criteria, they can use a technical standard of their choice. The key is they must be compliant with the criteria. The criteria speak to things like protecting data in transit and at rest, and securing access, things like that. So generally, CTA has been bringing together, our role has been to bring people together at the top end, and then as a standards body, we're convening industry experts to develop the key components of the program as ANSI standards.
So I want to turn back to Eric. I think many are familiar with Samsung SmartThings and the branding of Works with SmartThings. How does that fit into this discussion?
Yeah, thanks, David. So, we're prioritizing security on the product level, but also in the ecosystem level. And so third-party IoT device manufacturers who want to join our SmartThings ecosystem have to pass two things. First, they've got to have interoperability testing for seamless connections, and then there's security testing so that there are secure connections. The products that we manufacture also meet those requirements. So what's unique about our program is it started in 2017, and this was before a lot of these discussions were happening, and before NIST and ETSI and Europe and others had standards. So we were sort of an industry leader in driving the ecosystem towards more secure IoT. Since those standards, we're certainly taking them into account in our program, which is a voluntary program, and it's really moving the market to bring third-party IoT security up to a minimum baseline, because they see the value of getting the Works with SmartThings mark on their devices. We have now hundreds of manufacturers participating and thousands of devices in our ecosystem.
And Amit, Intel is one of hundreds of companies that's part of the Connectivity Standards Alliance, which has developed the Matter standard. How did they fit in? They were one of the organizations that was at the White House last October.
Yeah, so we are obviously supporting, as I mentioned, a lot of the standards activities. I think, CSA has done tremendous work in terms of starting to not just come with the criteria, but do the mapping. So part of the complexity in this world of emerging regulations and policies and standards, and we should talk about the EU Cyber Resilience Act. I hope we are discussing that in shortly. But we just have a lot of technical baselines, regulatory documents in this space. And as we are starting to think about it collectively, we are also aiming to not just reduce fragmentation and think about global harmonization, because IoT devices are going everywhere, but create a culture where manufacturers can understand what is required. So CSA has done tremendous work starting to map all these different standards and trying to understand how they fit into these documents, like of course, our NISTR in this area of consumer IoT, I want to say 8425, how all of these technical documents and numbers are fitting together per controls. And of course, we are collectively coming in CSA as well to start to think about the scheme and everything. And all of this is done in collaboration. I think this is the beautiful part about this. We understand that this important work to secure users, but also moving towards a future where users can better understand security. That's what we call usability, or what I love to say, the salience of security features, which is not just more information, but information they can understand. Okay, so this conversation about communicating security, which is not less important from the conversation about security itself, is done in a way that encompasses all the players that you're seeing here. So CTA, CSA, the standard bodies, global regulators, Europe, the government, Washington. We are very excited about that level of collaboration, and Intel is participating in that and contributing to these conversations.
Yeah, could I also
go
add,
for it.
Amit, thank you, that's perfect. And I want to add that CSA is also participating in this overall effort, and I expect they would be one of the very early licensees in order to issue the national mark.
Now, much of, and we'll come back to the CRA topic later in the conversation, but I think for the most part, much of what we've been talking about here is focused on consumer IoT. But a common question gets asked is, what about enterprise or industrial applications? Mike, are there parallels there that can be applied?
Yeah, if you recall the framework that I put up there, we had the NIST criteria up front on the left as an anchor of the program that all the scheme programs, all the labeling programs out there that want to qualify to issue the national mark have to comply with the NIST criteria. That NIST criteria, 8425 is the document number, that is a consumer profile for connected consumer devices. It's specifically about consumer products. Mm-hmm. But with this framework, you can pull out the NIST criteria for consumer and insert a different NIST criteria. NIST has, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a federal requirements profile.
There's the core baseline.
There's a core baseline. So something else could be substituted in, and we can handle a different market. The industrial IoT category is high on Washington's list in terms of improving cybersecurity. It's important to critical infrastructure, and it's potentially a new target. I think the White House has said that after consumer is launched, then it would be appropriate to look at what the next steps are in the same way for industrial IoT.
Yeah,
I
I was just about to say that we are experiencing a very interesting moment in security. We are seeing the convergence of OT, operational technology, and IT, information technology, and the physical and the cyber. But this convergence is moving from attacks and reality and conversation to RSA to regulations, which means that these standards like 62443, for example, or everything we are doing in OT would have to converge with IT. So we cannot think about the Alexa, right, separately from the, if for some reason someone decides to put the Alexa in a nuclear power plant, which is maybe a conversation about the importance of the fact that all of this should be risk-based, right? And there is actually something to say about the responsibility of the enterprise. So even enterprise security processes are convergence now with IT and OT. All of these devices, some of them coming from consumer, can operate with the same environment, right? Together with the MRI machine or together with the, smart grid machine, et cetera, et cetera. So this convergence is forcing not just the standards, but also the regulations to create an environment where we can map all these standards together into something usable. So I just wanted to mention that as well. And I know, NIST, this has been your approach from the get-go, right?
Yeah, I'd love to get NIST perspective,
absolutely. Kat. No, I think you touched on an important point. Previously to looking at the consumer space, because of the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act of 2020 that Mike mentioned, we did have to look at this very issue around the contextual risk that when you start looking at IoT, depending on where you place that IoT device, we were looking at it from a federal agency perspective, it was so dependent on the context of the use, which is part of the reason our approach in 800-213 really does establish a baseline, but it also builds in the perspective of the enterprise, which in this case is the federal agency, looking at the contextual risk of adopting IoT and bringing that within the enterprise, and how that then gets derived and flows down into the requirements for the cybersecurity of the device. And I think that's another reason why part of what you touched on, Amit, was so important. In particular, I think, when you're talking about an enterprise customer as well, that having that transparency so that an enterprise customer can understand what is the cybersecurity capabilities of this device because it is so contextual on their own environment and understanding how can I map my needs as the enterprise to what this product is offering is kind of a key component to driving better cybersecurity, as well as developing a shared kind of understanding of responsibility for cybersecurity, because it really is a shared cyber responsibility. It's not just on the product or on the enterprise, but that opening those communication lines is a key component. And I think labeling does that with the consumer, but I think when we start talking about industrial, we're going to be able to build on that even more, because industrial customers will really be able to take advantage, I think, of that transparency and that communication.
And I think that's a great segue, because whether you're talking about enterprise or consumer, cybersecurity is not static. It's an evolving threat. How do you ensure that a label reflects that? And I'll open that up to any of our panelists.
Sure, I'll start. Look, communicating with our customers is of utmost importance, especially with respect to security. But it has to be tailored appropriately. We think a cybersecurity ingredients list on the side of a box makes no sense. It's not, the average consumer is not going to understand it, and it's overly burdensome on the manufacturers that are going to have to update a box. And so that's why, the approach that we've taken here with a binary mark and a QR code is the better approach. That's the only way we're going to be able to update, the security posture of the device, and so inform the consumers as threats evolve. And it's going to be much more dynamic. Otherwise, we're going to have a static, ingredients list like you see fat content and otherwise in food. It's just there's not an apples to apples comparison.
Do you think? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, just one thing here that you don't get with food labels is a national product registry. There'll be a national product registry where there'll be an opportunity to do things like look up product or product categories, or websites from retailers will be able to populate part of their screen with the option, I only want to look at cybersecurity certified baby monitors, for example.
I appreciate these comments, and I agree, especially with respect to the electronic label. I want to add one more thing, which is I don't think we are talking enough about communication of security measures. I walk around the expo and I see so many products, innovations that are focusing simply on allowing the enterprise itself to visualize its posture of security and risk within the enterprise. And we are talking here about communicating that to users, right?
Yeah.
Right? And also trying to get to the place where the information is moving them to decide purchasing, whether they purchase or not. So we gotta just start focusing not just about the label and the nature of the label, but a much higher level theme of should we start thinking about the entire framework and measurements and how you communicate effectively, which might change based on the audience. So just to give you an example, I did my entire dissertation of terms of use. I'm probably the only individual that read all these contracts and terms of use on the internet. And we know already from consumer law that too much information doesn't work, right? And we have evolved there, and we think about usability and experimentation and empirical research, and how do you really get to users, and how you can evolve technical measures, right, to increase trust and verify the communication, and how do we gonna be communicating postures of security, for example, for B2B customers in an automated fashion using technology. I think the conversation should be not just about whether a label is effective or not, but how collectively we create a framework to start thinking about how to communicate effectively based on audience, using technology in a flexible approach as the risks and the threats mature. And I'm just gonna give you a final plug to the blog that me and Kat posted together just recently on this concept of calling for input. Should we start thinking about this concept of having, like we have the NIST cybersecurity framework, the NIST product security transparency framework, thinking about communication and really dedicating the conversation not just on security, but how to communicate security effectively.
I think you've raised a great point about communicating, and I think that raises the question, I'll ask this to any of our panelists, will consumers look for this label? You know, we've made the comparison, although there are many reasons why a nutrition label for food is very different, just as same an Energy Star label on products is very different than what we're talking about. But those are examples of things consumers have come to look for. Do you think they're interested, and will they look for a cyber label?
Do you want me to go first?
Go
Okay.
for it.
So there's some consumer research that's been going back for years on this question. And if you ask that question about 2015 or 2017, the answer would be, kind of like disappointing. What's been happening over the past 5 years or so is that consumers are increasingly aware that cybersecurity is an issue. They're increasingly interested. And now there's research that shows not only will they look for it, not all of them, but a majority will look for it, a majority will also pay more for a product that has some indication that it's more secure. There is some entanglement with the value proposition of the brand itself. So you can't separate the quality of the product, the perceived quality of the product in the consumer's mind from brand awareness, like, you know, is the Samsung or some other major brand where they have a high perception of quality, and the cybersecurity element. But when you sort of normalize for that, yeah, the mark actually helps. The second thing is it's not just the consumer that we're interested in looking for this label. Retailers, enterprises, system integrators. We know that federal procurement now has to look for some way of ensuring compliance with the NIST requirements, and this mark is de facto compliance with the NIST requirements. California IoT cybersecurity law was amended last year to include a safe harbor for companies that are in compliance with a NIST, with a third-party certification mark that meets NIST guidelines. So it's not, yes, the consumer will look for it. Market research now is indicating that the winds have shifted and the consumer is interested in some kind of transparency. But also, you know, retailers, enterprises, any large buyers have the same problem, which is how do I sort for this? How do I decide what is a more secure product so I can protect my network, protect my brand, protect what I'm doing out there? So yeah, the answer is actually the time is right.
Eric?
Yeah, I think we agree. We're seeing more and more consumers taking security and trust into account in their purchasing decisions. But I think a key essential point that we need to get done is consumer awareness campaigns, full stop. Because unless people understand what this label is about, it's not going to work. And so we think that industry can lead in this initiative, but government has an important role too. They're going to validate it, and they got to bring resources to the effort. So,
And incentivize manufacturers that are doing the right thing, not just by, for example, the voluntary measures, but actually just almost like a reputational, right, race to the top where these are celebrated.
Well, I think that is a good segue into the next question I had, which is how do you incentivize manufacturers to participate? Again, we've reiterated, we're talking about a voluntary program here. What needs to be on the table for manufacturers to want to step up and participate?
from a policy standpoint?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'll start. You can jump in. I think three things I think could supercharge manufacturer adoption. And sorry, we're going to do a little deeper dive in the policy space. But the first thing is called an earned safe harbor, and that's essentially liability protections. If manufacturers are going to go to the trouble of getting this mark, they need something in exchange, okay? And so if and when the administration launches this program, it would be very important to have a statement saying that, look, if a manufacturer meets the minimum baseline security, they get the mark, that is presumptively reasonable security, and you're protected from enforcement. The next step is having the Federal Trade Commission or any other enforcement agency issue a similar statement. And ideally, at the end of the day, which is very hard in Washington, is getting Congress to enact a law. So that would essentially give an earned safe harbor life beyond this administration and give that peace of mind to manufacturers. Point number 2, we need to have federal preemption. We can't have 50 different state IoT labeling programs. I mean, that is complex and confusing for a consumer, and also pretty burdensome from a manufacturer standpoint. We want to design a label for one sort of unified approach. And then finally, and I'll get off the stage after this, is we need mutual recognition. And that's the same problem, but sort of a fragmented approach on a global scale. We're seeing, as we'll talk about in a bit, some programs coming out of Singapore and elsewhere in Europe. And so making sure that when we build this program, that is harmonized with global approaches, because we're all global manufacturers, and if there are disparate programs, it's going to create costs, and it's going to slow innovative products to market. And so at the end of the day, those costs will probably be borne by the consumers. And so we need to think about these things at the outset.
So I want to pick up on that theme of mutual recognition. And Amit, I promised you we'd get back to CRA. So it's a good segue to say, Intel is, of course, a global company. The U.S. isn't the only country that's talking about a cyber label program. My question is global harmonization possible? And is it necessary for this U.S. program to be successful?
You want me to start?
Yeah.
I think it is possible, but the moment is now. And the reason is the technical standards that are supposed to be this backbone. So if the regulatory approach with the EU Cyber Resilience Act creates, so I just want to say at the outset, how many of you in the room have heard about the EU Cyber Resilience Act? I'm just interested. This is, in my view, the most comprehensive security regulation I've ever seen, period. There is never, it's like GDPR plus, okay? It's not about fines after the fact, ex-post compliance. If the product goes into Europe, it needs to come through the border, it needs to comply. And to comply, there is going to be a list of essential cyber requirements, Annex 1, and they are going to be tested via third-party certification or self-attestation. Simple as that. And the conversation is happening now. So if that regulation is evolving in a way where the list of essential cyber requirements from a scope perspective cannot allow us to fit within that, as you suggested, Mike, with your mapping, to fit it in a puzzle with the existing standards, we simply don't have the time to produce new standards to reach the level where this can take effect at the timeline they're marching towards 2027. So the risk is, while we launched the National Cybersecurity label here in the United States, the measures themselves would fragment what global manufacturers are going to start to plan to for products that are in the market in 2026 or should hit the market 2026. And may I remind you all, for Intel, for example, we are designing now chips for 2028. So we need to start to think about these issues right now. It is achievable, but the focus should be on the hard and important conversation of global, not just empty harmonization, but how do we take all these standards into account? And I want to add one more point about would consumers care. I come from law and economics. In fact, I'm co-founding this new company, Open Policy, because I'm such a believer in economics. And in economics, we know it doesn't matter if you educate all consumers. All you need is the informed minority. And by the way, the informed minority that creates the market for what is salient, what drives decision-making, is not just consumer. To our discussion, it's regulators, it's everybody in the market. So I actually think that on top of everything we discussed, government support should be in getting our data. We don't have data, empirical data at scale on this very important question of security communication. We have leaders from Berkeley. I see here Anne in the room, my friends from ICSI. from Berkeley have done research on this. My friends in Carnegie Mellon have done research on this. I think another important pillar of support is how can we get the funding and the action and the awareness that we need to drive more empirical research around this so we can educate the market. This is very useful.
We have about 5 minutes left in this session. If we do have any audience questions, you can come up to one of the microphones. Please state your name and affiliation and limit to one question, please. But as we're wrapping up here, and Mike, you referenced the fact that the next step is we expect the U.S. administration to make an announcement sometime in late May. What are the next steps?
Right, so we'll see that announcement that will tell us who we're working with. We'll be sitting down and working through, regardless of who it is, they're going to have administrative requirements such as the Federal Advisory Committee Act, to make regulations.
Notice of proposed rulemaking.
No, but the APA?
APA guidelines?
Yeah.
Administrative Procedures Act?
Thank you, Administrative Procedures Act. So we're going to have to work through those processes. We have a lot of work done already, though, so hopefully we can make that quick. We'll get the process up and running. We will be hopefully talking about a meaningful consumer education campaign. We will be setting up the National Product Registry database, working with retailers so that they have access to the database, working with manufacturers. I've heard from some manufacturers who are very interested in beginning now to look internally about which products they will qualify and the interesting reasons why, because the motivations vary. One company has competitors, another company has product safety issues, not issues, but considerations in cybersecurity of a connected device that can also cut off an arm is a real thing for them. So there's working with the manufacturers is another thing. And did you have? Yeah.
Not necessarily on that. I wasn't able to jump in. I feel I have to jump in since the S in NIST is standards. I agree. You cannot. I cannot say how strongly standards are important to this, but standards are voluntary, and I think harmonization can be achieved where there are common standards. But this only reinforces the importance of standards being worked in an open and transparent way, bringing together multiple stakeholders so that those standards can actually satisfy the needs of multiple jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. Because I think...
Open policy.
Absolutely. But I also think that expecting policies across jurisdictions to all say exactly the same thing is unlikely, but being able to develop a standard that could actually satisfy multiple jurisdictions, I think that is going to be the key to having mutual recognition and avoiding fragmentation. So I just wanted to
Could not agree more.
Yeah, absolutely. So felt the need to say that.
Let's take an audience question.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, my name is Jacques Kruse-Brandau. I'm with TÜV IT, TÜV Informationstechnik, which is part of TÜV Nord Group, and we are doing Communitarian certification as well. My question would be whether there is any let's say, risk assessment in the beginning. What is your, related to that risk assessment, what is your proposal for a manufacturer to do such risk assessment and then to be able to map the risks to a certain risk classification for his devices? And you were talking about the baseline requirements only the whole day. So the question is, if there is a higher risk related to a certain use case later on, how does the manufacturer can prepare himself? And is this higher risk then associated to a certain assurance level? And what is your perspective on this?
I'll jump on it because it's such an important question. One of my biggest concerns, especially with the CRA, is as we strive to get a lot of entities in the community to the baseline, we will take the higher risk environment down. So when we think about it, like the smart door collar doesn't have to have the same baseline measures like the grid or the MRI machine. So it's really critical, even from a security perspective, especially now when we have this moment of thinking about security baseline measures, to allow for higher risk capabilities like hardware security-based controls in the higher risk system. So I will answer my perspective on how we do it in 27402. So the risk management approach comes from a standard called 27001, ISO standard, very famous. And the idea is like you create a risk assessment for your controls, you create a risk assessment for your device, and you also document it. So there is also communication about your risk assessment, and based on the risk assessment, which also correlates with the notions of NIST 8259 and other documents, you match the baseline measures. That's how we do it in 27402. 62443, which is a different standard for OT, also has a risk assessment. The critical piece that I think we need to start figuring out as we are going into the revision of the cybersecurity framework, right, the CSF, is how to do risk assessments for products. That's a very important conversation, and I appreciate your question.
So we have hit time now. And Mike,
Oh, no.
if you could go to the last slide. Of course, you may be wondering, how can you find more information about this effort, and how can you stay updated? Here's the website here at our website, Consumer Technology Association, cta.tech. This slide deck will also be on the RSA site. We encourage you to follow that. Also has many resources of prior documents that we have filed. I want to thank everyone. Again, I want to thank our panelists for being part of this discussion. We hope you have a great rest of your show.
Thank you.